Okay, so I am Amber. For those of you that didn't hear me do this spiel the last time I was here, I will briefly revisit why I'm here, I guess. So I'm an engineer by education. So I have a bachelor's and a master's in industrial engineering. I discovered permaculture through organic gardening when I was a young mom with a little 2-year-old son who I wanted to feed the absolute best of everything, and I could not afford that at the grocery store. And so I'm like, well, Grandma had a garden. Note, I did not spend time with Grandma in the garden. Missed opportunity, because that woman could grow anything. I'm like, I will figure this out. And so a little 4x12 raised bed turned into 4, much larger raised beds turned into 7, turned into gardening the entire yard until it looked like that. And somewhere around the point in time where I started gardening on my neighbor's yard, I realized I was perhaps making a lifestyle choice. And not really
view out my front of my house. I
yes.
loved it.
Yes, Trudy and I go way back. So in 2012, bought 40 acres north of Lawrence, between Lawrence and Perry, built that house. When I say built it, I mean, we literally built it. I didn't pour the foundation or put in the septic, but I mixed the concrete in the walls and we did the timber frames. And so we built the house, and that took about 6 years. We thought it would be done in the summer. Yeah. So we did that. And this was an off-grid home. You can see our solar panels out back. So lived there for several years, and then life events happened. In that time, I did plant a few hundred fruit trees, and God only knows how many berry bushes and herbs and like thousands of plants to try and turn that into a permaculture homestead. And then, no, life changed. So a divorce and a remarriage later. In my life, I have a new last name. I was done last time I talked to you all, and now it's Thumann. I was Lehrman before that, so if you've heard Amber of any of those names, I did it all me. I'm just Amber, and that works. So now I live east of Wichita, a little outside of a community called Rose Hill, and I am doing the same thing on that property. So this is the beginnings of what will be a food forest in front of the house, and there's a large garden going in the back, and starting over again in this place with a late 70s ranch house.
You never learned, do you?
No, yeah, but it's kind of fun. I get to learn things from one, like, that didn't go like I wanted last time. We will do it different this time. So we'll see. So this is why I'm here. I live this stuff. I have been teaching permaculture design at KU since 2017. I teach it every semester and summer. You can also take the full permaculture design course, where I'm one of 4 teachers in the summer through the Kansas Permaculture Institute. I'm a board member there, and I head up all their education programs. So that's enough about me. So today we're going to talk about water, and I wanted to start with, why does this matter? So this chart is how much of the sun's energy gets turned into plant biomass by ecosystem. Okay, so units don't matter, right? Stuff at the bottom converts a whole lot more sunlight into plant matter than the stuff at the top, right? So there are 2 things that determine where an ecosystem lands on this list. What are they?
Rainfall.
Rain, yeah, so the presence of water. Presence or absence of water.
Sunlight.
Nope.
Soil.
Nope.
Soil type?
Temperature. Someone said temperature. Yeah. Does it freeze? How much of the year is it not frozen? Right?
Okay.
So we can't do a whole lot about temperature, obviously. It should not be 70 the last week of February, but here we are. Temperature will happen, but we can do a whole lot about water. Which means that we can move our living spaces down this chart. We can make them increasingly productive and increasingly resilient by enabling water to be where it needs to be when it needs to be there, right? So catching and using that resource lets us generate regenerative, thriving systems. So the second part of that is, where do we need the water to be? So if this is all places fresh water can be, I left the oceans off, right? Because we don't use salt water for our plants generally. What is the only place on that list that our plants can actually get to the water? Soil, right? it's gotta be in the soil. Right, so our job. Not used to there being something. Is to get as much water into the soil as we possibly can. And in permaculture, we have the mantra, slow it, sink it, spread it. Right, so take water, slow it down across the landscape, which gives it a chance to sink in, and spread it as evenly as possible. Right, so everything is getting its fair share. So we don't have wet and dry places, we have even, complete soil moisture everywhere. Okay. So what we're talking about today is some ways to do that. And we will for sure talk about rain barrels and cisterns, rain gardens, and urban swales, so small scale swales. If we have time, we will touch on microphones because they're also cool and exciting, but I don't know if in an hour. Okay, this is our plan. So since this is a rain barrel workshop, we should probably start with rain barrels. Right? And you'll be building, those of you who are staying for that workshop, we'll be building something kind of like this, right? So rain barrels are nice. This size is pretty easy to find. It's very easy to build for yourself. It's easy to use the water. Like it's a very accessible way to catch rainfall when it happens and use it later. Okay? And there's a lot of benefits to that. Right, so if we want to gravity feed water, generally speaking, for most of us, we'll just do a quick poll. For how many of you is your roof the tallest thing other than a tree on your lot? So the water is already tall. So all we have to do is not let it fall all the way down yet. And rain barrels let us do that. And so at that point, you can just connect the hose and gravity feed it. You don't have to have a pump for pressurization. And if you have enough elevation, it takes about 4 feet, then you can even gravity feed a soaker hose with a rain barrel, okay? And it either takes 4 feet depth of water or 4 or 5 feet of elevation over what you're watering to get enough pressure for a soaker hose. If you're wondering, just random data. The water is clean, right? It hasn't run through soil. It hasn't run through your neighbor's trash. It hasn't picked up who knows what that got sprayed on who knows what. So the water is clean. It is exactly what our plants want. Right? So it's very high value water as opposed to catching the surface flow from your neighbor's yard. Right? And it's often wasted. Like if we think about what happens on a standard lot, water comes down your downspout. And about how long does it take for most of us that water to hit the curb, the storm drain, and be in the Kansas River?
It takes a long time.
Good. It should. But for most of us, it's a completely wasted resource. And if we look at what's happening with climate, the cost of that waste is increasing. So what we're seeing, and what models would say is the trend that's going to continue, is we are getting less frequent, larger storms. We're getting a month of rain in 2 days. And so this is a challenge for us because when that inundation happens, most of it is going down the storm drain. And we are effectively then in a drought where our plants have no increased soil moisture for 3 or 4 weeks. And then they're getting drowned with 6 inches, which unless you have really, really amazing soil, it can't absorb at that pace. And so the ability to hold water longer and spread it out over a larger time window is becoming critical if we want to be able to continue to have healthy ecosystems around us. So the stuff we're talking about today will let you do that. Okay. So rain barrels are huge for that. So here's a fun question. How much water actually falls on your roof? And so the master gardeners, unfortunately, invited an engineer to come and talk to you. And that means I do math. So would someone like to volunteer how big your house is in square feet on a single level? So if you have a basement, just one level.
2,100.
2,100 square feet. Beautiful. So a 2,100 square foot house, and we're going to do the math for 1 inch of rain. Okay. So how much is an inch of rain in feet? 1/12. There we go. So times 1/12 of a foot. Someone has to get a calculator out and do that. So you all have a calculator in your pocket. Yeah, that's a phone. Someone divide 2100 by 12 for me, please. So you didn't know you were gonna have to work in this workshop. What? 75? 175, beautiful. So 175 cubic feet. Now multiply that times 7.48. That's how many gallons are in a cubic foot.
You don't have to do it, that's on
1,309.
1,000. That's right. Okay. 1,309 gallons come off of that roof for every 1 inch of rain that falls. If we want an even more fun statistic, if you happen to live in or around Lawrence, multiply that times 39, which would be the average inches of rainfall that fall in Lawrence in a year.
51,051.
51,051 gallons a year that you are largely sending down a storm drain. And see, you just brought up the reason that I usually introduce this slide in my class, but isn't that cute? So the PDF of this will be available, it has that math problem on it. Which means that really we should be looking at cisterns more than rain barrels. Like rain barrels are a great accessible way to get started.
Does that not account for the pitch of your roof?
Doesn't matter,
Okay.
because the rain is falling straight down.
Oh,
So however steep your roof is, it's still vertically the same amount. Now, if you want to be super precise, then you would account for square footage of porches and eaves and things like that. And like if you're an engineering nerd like I am, then you can look up your house on the county GIS and you can use a polygon and you can map out the shape of your roof and find out exactly how many square feet of roof you have. And you can be very, very precise with your map if you would like to do that. I wasn't going to do that to you guys today. You can, and that would be the most precise way to do the calculation. Yeah, absolutely. So cistern system. So these are 400-gallon cisterns installed at the Permacommons Community Garden at 14th in Pennsylvania. If you want to go actually visit the picture, it exists. And that is really the scale that if you want to do meaningful rainfall catchment on your house, you would need to be. Okay, so I'm going to plug that in to your brain. Now, whenever we look at these systems, there are some elements of installing a rain barrel or cistern that are important. And some are more important the bigger the thing is. Okay, so the first one is some way to keep crap from getting in the barrel. So we don't really want all the leaves from the trees that are on your roof to end up in the barrel. We don't really want the dirt that ends up on your roof in the barrel. We don't want little bits of asphalt for your asphalt shingle roof in the barrel. Now, for those that are very, very concerned about watering plants with water that came off of an asphalt shingle roof, generally speaking, it's fine. Sorry, it's not actually, they're generally fine. There's not actually enough toxin in that water to cause a problem for plants. Right? It is diluted enough. Now, drinking it is a different thing. So we would take other steps, but for plants, it's generally just fine. So what we can do with that for a smaller rain barrel type system, usually all you need is a screen. And we'll be doing that in the workshop today, I believe, putting some kind of a leaf screen. Okay, well, we'll talk about it then in the workshop, how you would put a leaf screen on the water. It's generally for something of the 55-gallon rain barrel variety. You're just going and getting window screen mesh and then putting it over wherever the water is coming in. Okay, yeah.
I noticed in the last picture, you actually had a downspout also in addition to.
So that's a first flush diverter. So that's the next thing. So whenever you step up into a larger system, right? So a 55-gallon rain barrel at the end of the season, you're probably going to dump out and it's pretty easy to tip over, hose out and clean. You're not going to do that. That guy, right? So if some stuff goes by your screen on your 55-gallon rain barrel, world is not ending, right? On this one, we have a problem. So we need to be fancier in how we protect it from debris. And so the first flush diverter is the name for this thing over here. And what that is whenever water starts coming down, this endpoint is choked off. So water fills up this vertical along with the majority of the leaves and pollen and dirt and little bits that have fallen off your roof, all that stuff is gonna go into this pipe first. And because this is very slow, it's gonna fill up. And as soon as it fills up, the water is gonna go over into the cistern, which means effectively most of the crap ends up in this pipe. And then once a season, you take that pipe off, clean it out, and put it back up. Okay? So that's what a first flush diverter is. You can buy them pre-made, or you can make your own with a little ball valve, like you can get fancy or not on this, however you want, but it gives you a way to get most of the stuff out. You can also put in a small gravel filter, which if you're talking about a cistern that's in ground entirely or partially, these become really easy to do, where the water dumps into like a, if you want to be super low tech, it's a 55-gallon barrel cut in half. If you want to make it pretty, you can make it prettier. But you fill it up with pea gravel and sand. So like gravel, layer of wheat cloth, sand. And the water percolates through that very quickly, but it picks up all the debris. So what comes out is clean water. Okay. So that would be a slightly fancier, more advanced thing that you could do. And if you were going to try and drink the water, I would do that. I would take the step to do that kind of system, not just a first flush diverter. Okay. So these are the strategies we use to keep stuff from getting in there. The next big thing is, what are you going to do when it freezes? Because it's going to freeze. So either you need this thing to be insulated or partially underground so that some part of it doesn't freeze and you're not going to break the tank if it's full of water and we get cold weather. Or you need to drain it at the end of every season and have a diverter. So basically, in some systems where this is a ball valve, it means that your first flush diverter is cracked for most of the season and wide open in the off season. So all the water goes down that and none of it goes over to your cistern. That's the simplest way to do it. I've also seen people do a shut off up at the top at that Y so that they just close the door to the cistern in the wintertime. So you just need to have a strategy. For your 55-gallon barrel, you just empty it, right? And then the disconnect, you can put the bottom of the downspout back on if you've disconnected it, right? So it just becomes a seasonal maintenance thing to keep the water from freezing in there. Then you need to deal with, do I need a foundation? Okay, so for a 55-gallon rain barrel, a couple of cinder blocks that get it tall enough that you can screw a hose under it, it's fine. Like, this does not need to be a stressful thing at all. About anything will hold up a 55-gallon barrel. If you're talking about something like that, like if we want to do a quick math problem. So if you multiply, well, I don't need a calculator for this. So water weighs about 8 pounds a gallon. And that is a 300, we'll call it 400-gallon cistern. So that is 3,200 pounds. Yeah, so that's a lot. I'm not just going to tip that over and empty it out. Nah. And if your yard has any kind of significant slope, then it's going to want to start tipping and moving, right, as it gets full. And so when you're looking at a larger water catchment device, you need to make sure it's on flat ground and some kind of a foundation. For generally level, mostly level spaces, that foundation can be as simple as leveling a really good spot and then putting some kind of sand or gravel on it, and then putting the cistern on it. If you have actual slope to your yard, then you're going to want to put some kind of masonry or concrete foundation that is anchored, so it's not going to try and slide down. So consider that. And then the last thing, right? So we started out saying we need to stop things from getting into the cistern. We also need to stop things from growing in the cistern. And those things that can grow include mosquitoes and algae. Mosquitoes are bad for us. And algae is not great for our plants or the cistern. They'll clog up the spigot, they'll clog up the hose, they make the water toxic. It's gross looking and it smells bad. So we don't want this. So the trick to keeping algae out is really to keep light out, right? It's a plant and it needs sunlight to grow. So this looks like paint. And the strategy would be generally to paint it black to keep the sun out. Now, if I have something black in the sun all the time, what happens? It cooks. Yeah. And suddenly I'm watering my plants with 85 or 95-degree water, and they don't like that really at all. And so you do the coat of black and then you do a coat of white. Okay, so that it reflects the light. When you're looking at larger cisterns like this one, right, it came in a light blocking dark green. So no light is getting into this now. I would come back and paint that white in our climate because of the heat we see in the summer. Okay. So that's kind of what you need to do. Any questions about that? Generally speaking, how do we make a rain barrel happen?
So again, so many rain barrels are sold in, like you say, green, black, etc. So you're saying you should paint them white?
It would be my recommendation. The world is not going to end if you don't.
Right.
They will not grow algae in those colors. Light isn't getting through. So you're not going to have a water quality.
It's the heat of the
But
water.
it will get hot. And the other thing is the plastic barrels, which most of what we're talking about is plastic, will break down in UV. Even the UV stabilized plastics over time will break down. And so if you paint them so that they're not actually experiencing UV light, they will last longer. And so paint is a pretty cheap way to protect that investment.
How do the mosquitoes get in?
Yeah.
Usually, however, the water gets in.
So they could come down the spout,
Well,
or
if,
the roof or whatever.
yeah, usually if they'll come through some kind of an access point there. So if you have a downspout that's free flowing water into a rain barrel, like you can put a chain hanging down from your downspout to your rain barrel and the water will follow the chain. Well, if you don't have a really good quality mesh there, then the mosquitoes will just go in the hole and they exit water, right? So usually they get in however the water gets in. And so protecting that is pretty important.
The mosquitoes.
Yes, so you either make sure that that opening and any overflow openings have a tight mesh, a window screen type mesh on them. And that's a maintenance item, right? You have to check it and replace it as it gets damaged. Or you can seal all of that up, right? So like this one is hard plumbed in and that's a sealed connection. So there isn't anywhere for them to get in. On the 55-gallon rain barrel type thing, that's nearly impossible. And so you end up installing that mesh.
Is it okay to put mosquito dens inside a rain barrel?
I don't like chemicals.
Yeah.
So if you're okay watering your plants with it, then as a personal choice, sure you can. It's not what I do.
Amber?
Yeah.
I don't remember where I got this idea, but if you put a little bit of cooking oil, it stays on the top of the water. And I don't know if it stops the mosquitoes as they try to go in, but that it acts as a
It can. Dish soap will do that too. Anything that makes a film,
and on the top, so.
but you have to replace it.
Right.
Mhm. Yep. Other questions before we move forward? All right, so we already talked about that. So moving on to rain gardens. Who here has been around a rain garden before? Do we have a mental picture of what these things look like? About 50-50. Okay, so we'll start with what the thing is. So a rain garden is not a pond. It's a shallow depression in your yard that's designed to fill up with water when it rains and then hold that water long enough for it to soak into the ground. Right, so this is a catchment thing. Not designed to have standing water all the time. Yeah.
For those members of the public who are here who might not have a mental picture, we have one right in front of the extension office. If you'd like to go visit one.
Yes. So most of the time, this looks like a depressed flower garden. And when it rains, it looks like a small pond. Okay. It is a pretty simple system for getting that large, we talked about large rain events. We've all experienced them. Right. So if I catch 400 gallons of the 1309 that fall on my roof in rain barrels and cisterns, and then I direct the rest of it into rain gardens, it's still going to soak into my landscape. And water moving through soil goes 300 to 500 times slower than water moving over the surface. Which means if it would take 5 minutes for water to get from my downspout to the storm drain, it's going to take months for it to get that same distance through the ground. Okay, and so if what I really need is to hold my 1 month of rain that fell tonight for the next 3 weeks until I get next month's rainfall in one night, I just did it. Right? I just got it into the soil profile and it will be there for the next 3 weeks. Okay, so that's really what rain gardens are letting us do. If we look at the parts of this is not a high-tech thing. This is not super fancy. You're going to decide where you want to put it. It can be any shape or size you want it to be. And for most of us, we're going to take a shovel because a rain garden is 1 to 2 shovels deep, which if you want to like an actual specification is somewhere between 10 and 18 inches-ish. Okay. And then you're going to take the bottom of that and you're going to put something that will always be permeable. That will always let water through. So that can be sand, that can be good soil, right? Good compost, something like that. It is a planting medium because you're going to put plants into this. And you're going to fill the rest of it up with wood mulch. You can use straw, you can use other forms of mulch. It doesn't have to be wood. But all of them will break down every single year and you will be putting new mulch in your bed like in August. And the following April. And it just becomes more of a maintenance thing. Wood chips, generally speaking, will break down and you can top them off in a rain garden a couple of times before you're dealing with needing to remove material and put new mulch down. Okay, so wood chips just last longer. Yeah.
I put a dry creek in my yard that has small stones in it. That's where the water collects. So does it act the same?
It depends on contour and how the water's moving. So if your dry creek is laid out more like a swale, which we'll talk about next, where it is basically on contour and water fills up there and stays until it sinks in, then it's acting like a swale, right? Which is not a rain garden in a depression, but it's still sinking water and doing that function. A lot of people do dry creeks to move water from one place to another, and in that case, it's not. You're just using a prettier method to get it to the storm drain. So it depends. Yeah, that's a good question. Losing my clicker. So the soil that we dig out, usually we're going to berm up on whatever the downhill side is, so that we get the depth, and so that the top is level. Okay. And making it level and figuring out how tall it is can be as easy as a 4-foot level on an 8-foot board for a small feature. Like this doesn't need to be fancy. You can also get a transit, like a laser transit, and make things very, very precise. If you have a highly sloped yard, I would do that. Okay. If you have very level slope, very low slope yard, then it's not necessary to get to that level of technique. And if you need help with what to do with a transit, reach out to KPI. If you happen to be a KPI member, you can also check out ours for free. I'll just put in that plug for KPI, because we do make those tools available to our members. And then we use them in our classes. Okay, so we're going to do that. And then you have to figure out where the water is going to go when the rain garden fills up. Because we are definitely, absolutely going to get enough rain to fill up the rain garden and overflow. Okay. If you don't think we are now, we will next year or the year after. So you have to decide, where is that overflow? Where is it going to go when this fills up? And that can look like a pipe, right? A little bit under the ground, like is illustrated there, that then connects to wherever you want the water to dump out. It can look like, and we'll see a picture here in a little bit, a micro swale ditch in your yard that looks mystically like a path. We're going to show you that in a second. I'll come back to it. Where the water moves when the rain garden fills up. But whenever we're doing this, we have to know, how is the water getting to it? And how is it going to get away when it's full? Where is it going to go next? So rain gardens also, I'm assuming that I'm talking to a whole room full of plant people. Is that a pretty safe assumption? Yeah. You can plant so many different things in a rain garden. Because there are plants that really want to be sopping wet and then completely dry. And they love the bottom of a rain garden. And there are plants that hate having wet feet but are thirsty. And they really like the berm of a rain garden. Because the soil under the rain garden is wet all the time, but that berm is not. And so they can send their little roots down and find the water where they want it and have their other roots be nice and dry, and our prissy plants can be very happy. And if we stretch out a little farther around the garden, like the whole area around it will have more moisture in the soil than areas that are not close to a rain garden or a microsoil, right? We're creating concentrated moisture. And so plants that need more water than average, the ones that you are dragging yourself out to water in the middle of July when it's 110 degrees, can be planted close to the rain garden, and they will need radically less and possibly no water. So this is the magic of water moving slowly through the soil once we finally sink it in. Okay? And so the presence of the rain garden gives us lots of flexibility and potentially a tiny space. And you can plant so many different things. Okay, so there are example plants up here that are mostly natives. This is a layout of a rain garden in Kansas City. Yeah.
I'm sorry, did you say that we were gonna get PDFs?
I can send a PDF. So you would need to talk to Nikki or Sharon or someone here, get on the list, but they will have a PDF of the slides.
It will also be recorded and up on our YouTube channel within the week.
So, okay. Yep. So there are lots of things you can do. I personally, just because I'm mostly a food growing person, really like to put watermelons around the rain garden because they really like that moisture, and I can make it a well-drained soil. And so in Kansas, being able to grow watermelons is kind of cool. But that's just me. So don't feel like it has to be all perennials. Like you can use it as gardening space as well. You just can't disturb the whole thing like you would a garden. You can interplant some annual vegetables in there too. So here's some examples of what it could look like. I would encourage you to go look at the one here because it's beautiful. They did a very, very good job with the rain garden here. It's a demonstration. That is rain gardens. So what questions do you have about those? Yeah.
I just had a quick question. I noticed that a lot of the plants that were chosen and a lot of this discussion would be in the assumption it's in full sunlight. What if you have an area that's ideal for rain garden, but it's in shade?
You're gonna plant different plants.
Okay.
There are other things. So, like
So it's not a
here,
problem being shade, that's nice. Okay.
no, it just changes the plants.
Okay.
And so basically in the basin of the rain garden, you're looking for Mediterranean style plants because they're used to a monsoon followed by a dry season, and they deal with that in it completely underwater and then fine, cycle just fine. And then around the edges, any plant that would grow normally in the shady spot or the partly shady spot will grow fine.
I did something.
Okay. I'm not
I did it
surprised.
twice.
You seem to do a lot of things.
I did it twice in my yard. Someone convinced me about bringing the water coming down in the backyard out and away from the house. And I put in what they called a dry well.
Okay.
So I
Yeah.
dug down and there's filtration. Then when it's dry, there's a hole. And when there's rain, there's water.
Mhm.
Could I convert it to a rain garden? If I
Possibly.
backfill it?
You would, yeah, you would lose capacity.
Okay.
And so you would just need to look at there's so many variants when you're designing water.
It's okay, just
You
to
just have to
know.
look at the amount of water and where it would go next and make sure that you're
Okay.
not, that you're still catching enough to not make a problem.
Where it goes next, one place is a garden, the other place is down a rock path. So
Yeah,
it's
then
no
yes,
place to
absolutely.
go.
you
It's
can
just,
convert it.
it could be
Yeah.
pretty if I could.
Yep, you can do that.
Thank you.
Okay. Urban swales. Who has heard of a swale before? Excited. I usually have to start with, what the crap is that? So, yeah, so for those who have never heard the term before, a swale is a ditch on concrete. Okay, so a ditch where the bottom of it is completely level for the entire run of the swale. Now, for anyone who wants to be super precise or who is dealing with a very large landscape, something over like 10 acres, you change the design of the swale at that scale. I'm not talking about that today, but I will talk about it if you come up to me after class, how you would modify for that, okay? And there's a formula for how you change that slope when dealing with very large acreage. and complex topography. But for most of us, in our backyards, it's a ditch on contour. It just needs to be level. And what happens is it fills up much like the rain garden. Right? So water comes from wherever the water is coming, across the landscape, hits the ditch. What does water do whenever you pour it into something? Like if I had a gutter that was perfectly level and I poured water in here, where is the water going to go? Yeah, it's going to go over there and it's going to fill the whole thing up evenly. So that is the effect we're getting with a swale. So if I direct my downspout, which is a point load, right, into a swale, it's going to spread that water across wherever I dug the ditch. And as long as the ditch is perfectly level, the whole thing will fill up at the same rate and it will discharge the water at the same rate across that whole space. Okay? So it's a way to spread the water out to equalize moisture across the landscape. And it creates, much like the rain garden, it creates focused areas of moisture. So you get this water lens that's in the picture, which essentially says that water is going to soak in here and it's going to start moving through the soil. And right behind it, more water is going to soak in. And so that area immediately downhill of the swale is just wetter. I have to tell a funny story. I think I have enough time for a funny story. So we have a board member named Bill, and he's a great guy. There's all kinds of cool permaculture things. And one of the things he did at his farm near Leavenworth is put in these 3 very large swales. Between the 3, he calculated, because he's also an engineer, you can see why I like Bill, that they could hold an Olympic swimming pool of water when it rains. So lots of water. So he put these in, and a few years later, it had been a dry year, or had been like 6 weeks since we had had a rain, middle of summer. Grass was very tall, and he's like, I should probably go mow. Right? Because it's tall. And so he starts at the top of the hill and he mows around the top swale 1, right? The top swale, no problem. Mows through swale 2, no problem. Gets to mowing on the downhill side of swale 3, and his tractor, right, because this is a farm, sinks axle deep in mud below swale 3 because the water was still there after 6 weeks of no rain. And so he has a funny, not funny story about using his truck to drag his tractor back out of a mud puddle in the middle of a Kansas drought. But this is the power we have with sinking water into the soil. And it doesn't have to be an Olympic swimming pool of water to make a difference. So for scale, I did tiny little swales on the uphill side of my garden beds in Perry, at that farm. And I filled them up with wood. So random half-rotten firewood logs that I didn't get to, and topped off with wood chips. They look like the paths in the garden. They were the paths, like I walked on them. But every time it rained, they filled up with water and they sunk that water in right next to my garden bed. I watered 1/3 as often after I put those in as I was watering before. Because I would check the soil, I put my hands in it, it's still wet. It doesn't need water. And that's the effect. And this was a trench like that. I did a shovel. Okay, so small features make a huge difference. And you can do this in your yard. So this is a swale system set up that is going to get backfilled with mulch. So these will look like pathways, and the space in between will eventually become garden beds. This isn't my house. I stole it from somebody else. But you can see where up by the little rain barrel by the downspout, there is a ditch. And this ditch that's running between the swales is shallower than this one. Right? Water will always go to the lowest point, which means it's going to flow downhill through this trench. And as soon as it hits each of these, it's going to fill them all the way up until they're as full as the shallow one. And then it's going to continue down the shallow one and fill the next one up and fill the next one up and fill the next one up.
So the overflow is the beginning, is that?
So it starts up there and
The
it
overflow
goes.
from the rain barrel,
Let's see, I have the
that's
laser
what it
pointer.
looks like.
Right, so this,
Yep.
right, is going to flow through this, through a little bit of a contour swale, and then it's going to pick up an overflow shallow cut here, only a few inches deep. And then it's going to fall into this ditch and spread out all the way across the yard. And when that one's full, it's gonna go through this shallow and it's gonna fill up this ditch, which is on contour all the way through the yard. And then it's gonna flow down here, and I don't know if there's another ditch off the picture there, but you can basically do it for as much yard as you have. Yeah, Karen.
I think, the common ground.
Yeah, we're gonna look at them
Has
actually.
been set up.
They do, they do.
If people need an example.
Yep, we're gonna look at that slide. Actually, I have them in the presentation as an example, because they do all of the things. Yeah. Yeah,
All of my gardens have, wood mulch pathways. And you can walk through them and see them.
Yeah.
I have them put hardwood under those paths so they wouldn't be dark.
Mhm.
Have I been stupid? Should I have?
No.
Trenches so that next part, so that they still can get weeds, but would it fill with water?
it would if it's on contour. It depends on the slope. For how that would work. And cardboard very quickly breaks down to the point that water will move through it, but weeds won't come up. And so you're not doing bad things. Cardboard is it's a great use for that product instead of sending it to a landfill. So you're not doing a bad thing there. But whether the trenches would fill up is entirely dependent on if it's on contour. How is it moving across the landscape? Right, so these folks are designing their upcoming landscaping with contour in mind, which is what in permaculture we would say you should do. You should design your water catchment system and then design your gardens around your water catchment system. So yeah,
So the one thing we can't really get a good perspective is that backyard does slope down.
yes, it's a very slight slope. This is not a steep backyard, but it doesn't need to be. Like if it's a 1/4 inch lower over there than it is here, the water is going that way. It really doesn't. And this is a common misconception. I have a lot of people who talk to me about say, but my yard's flat. Like, I assure you it is not. I 100% guarantee that if I take an instrument out, you have drum across your yard. It may not be much, but you need an inch. Like, you got it. So.
It's sloping the other way.
Then your overflow matters at the bottom. You can still catch and hold it, and it's actually a great way to prevent like flooding in basements, because you can spread and move water away from it while still letting it soak in. Like the design gets stickier, but it's not that complex. But yeah,
This may be term definitions, different things, but the guy that had the big swales,
Mhm.
if you've got large property, at what point is a swale a terrace? Is it? are they
so
the same thing? I mean.
no,
They're for erosion primarily, right?
they are. So that's a great question, because this is a common misconception that I get people that say, well, I already have swales, and they're actually ag terraces. So an agricultural terrace is at a 4% slope. And so it isn't there to hold water and let it soak in. It's actually there to make the water go away without running rapidly over land. So it's there to slow it down, but keep it steadily moving off the property and not actually let it soak in.
So if you have a larger space, there is a significant difference between
Yes.
terracing and
Yeah.
swales.
Yeah. Actually, so I was putting in a set of swales with a dozer contractor who usually works on farm properties. It was like a 5-acre property, so it was big enough that I wasn't going to do it with a shovel, but small enough to be real feasible to hire someone for a day. And he kept asking me, like, you sure you don't want me to put a little slope on this? I'm like, nope, dead level, please. I would like it to be completely dead level. Are you sure? Like, we can make the water go over there. Nope, I would like it to stay right here. We're gonna be fine. He was a good, I'm not maligning him. It just wasn't what he's used to. Like, he's always putting in ag terraces with a 4% slope, and it's what he knows. But that is not what we're doing. Yeah, so that's a great question. And a really common misconception.
In that type of setup where you have mulch or wood chips filling it up, is there any problem with a very, very heavy downpour, washing that stuff out?
Depends on how you design your overflow and what is around the trench. So you can get a situation where so much water accumulates at a level that any large chunks of mulch will float away and end up somewhere else. And so the trick with that is, how much catchment do I have? How fast? When am I going to hit that? and designing your overflow so that you don't get that much water. Right, so that's the short answer without doing like math or having a specific place. So the answer is yes, that can be a concern, and it's in how you design a multifaceted system. On something like this in a backyard scale, we're not typically talking about enough water for that to be a major issue. And especially if you put like planting beds around that, like if we envision this project completed where all of those trenches are now mulched pathways and the space in between them is planted with like raised bed gardens or flower beds or those things, where's the mulch going to go? Right, it's just going to end up a little farther down the trench by a different raised bed. Okay, like we're fine. Right. So in a backyard system, it's not as much of a thing. When you're doing larger scale things filled with mulch, you really do have to look at where is that biomass going to go. Yeah.
I'm assuming that one would use undyed mulch and so forth.
I generally would, yes.
Yeah.
But that is a me choice. You don't have to. In terms of water, it will function the same and hold water the same because the water holding capacity is determined by the size of the chips, not by the color. But the water that results, like that dye, is going to end up in your soil.
Yeah.
And so like I wouldn't do it in a vegetable garden. But your mileage may vary. Right? You can do what you want. Okay. All right. So let's look at kind of the time lapse. Not a very good time lapse because I'm not quite that fancy. So this is the yard of Bill and Becky Wilson, who run Midwest Permaculture. That is an awesome organization. They do a lot of educational classes. I will put a plug in for them. They're awesome people. So this is their yard when they moved in. Very classic, looks very flat, fescue yard. I call your attention to this little stretch over here and that yew tree. So they teach permaculture. So they looked at the yard and said, well, that will not. So they started doing a water catchment system. So this is that yew tree. Okay. So you can ground, we kind of shifted the picture over to that corner. So what we have here, I'll use my fancy little laser pointer thing, is we have a downspout that's going into a slightly off contour swale, feeding into an on contour swale from across here, slightly off contour shallow, like we saw in the last picture, on contour swale. We have a rain garden cornered here, a rain garden just off the picture here, and this rain garden in the foreground, in the middle of being established. Okay, and they built up planting beds on the edges of the rain garden so that they could pull some of that moisture sideways and grow food crops, like this is sweet potatoes in this first year. Yeah.
I assume the green stuff around that is ground cover and not grass.
It is a heavily clover shifted yard. It's not a non-mowed ground cover, but it is mostly white clover. So they overseeded and then selected for the white.
It's not too much for sweet potatoes.
No, because they're up on the mountains. They're getting the advantage of that dry feet, wet feet, like a like thing. Like the watermelon. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry, can you explain on contour and off contour again?
Sure. Yeah, so the different, what is on contour mean? So it means that it's just completely dead level. So something that is on contour, like if I have a ditch completely on contour and I take a garden hose and I start putting water in one end, it will fill all the way across the ditch and then start raising from there. Yeah. That would be on contour. So now let's take another step forward. That's what it looks like a couple of years ago. Now these guys are south of Illinois, south of Chicago, Illinois. They're in Illinois south, about an hour south of Chicago. This is not a hugely different climate from where we live. And this is their front yard. They don't water that. It waters itself every time it rains. If I remember the statistic correctly, every time it rains, this system sinks about 1,200 gallons of water into their front yard. And you can't see it in the picture, but because I went there, I can tell you that when these 3 rain gardens overflow, You can actually see it a little better in this picture, but this back edge on their property line is the low side of the lot. So it slopes from this side to this side and behind the house. So the backyard is lower than the front yard. So these overflow against a berm they built. They just piled up dirt, some of it from the rain gardens. And it runs slowly downhill across this and into a whole separate set of swales and rain gardens through their garden beds, their main vegetable gardens in the backyard. There, and so if they get too much water from their two downspouts on the front, right, they water everything in the front with that water. And then they send it to the backyard and they double water all of their food crops with it, along with the downspouts on the backside of the house. And then if that isn't enough catchment, I guess it can go into the creek behind the house.
That's like double.
Absolutely, double, triple, quadruple over what we normally do. Right, and so it takes a serious rain for water to leave their property. Yeah. They do, they do. So they have, I don't remember how big they are, but on the backside by the garden, they have a couple of elevated larger barrels like we saw at Permaculture, that 400 to 500 gallon white cistern size. Yeah. And they've got kind of a cool aquaponics set up back there. It's just a neat place. I have fun there. Won't lie. You have a question?
Yeah, so I'm thinking flatland and how to save water off each of the spouts. And I'm wondering if you can't put a rain barrel at every single spout, I'm wondering if there's a way that you can somehow have a drain and then somehow add some hardware that would make it smaller into soaker hoses and then have all your soaker hoses laid out. Is that ever done?
I mean, you can. The challenge is usually volume.
Yeah.
Like the plumbing exists. You can buy enough plumbing parts to make that system happen. So it's,
Doesn't work.
but we have well, so if we picture when those soaker hoses are going to be full of water.
Yeah.
When it's raining.
Right.
Right, everything's already getting water when it's raining.
Yeah.
Right, and so what we really need to be able to do is hold it somewhere,
Yeah.
right? And if rain barrels aren't possible, then look at swales and rain gardens. Because it'll hold and sink it. Like we don't have just one tool in our toolbox. We've got lots of them and you can combine them however you want. So here in a minute, we'll look at the permacommons garden and they do all of it. They've got ponds and rain gardens and swales and all of it.
I'm just thinking of other alternative solutions to flatland. We don't have contour.
You always have contour. Guarantee it. Unless you have had a dozer level it. But even then, I had a dozer level a foundation spot and it still had a low side. The water still went to one corner.
How do you figure that out? Because as a total beginner, I walk in my backyard, we just bought a house, we haven't surveyed something, you know, and all this.
Yeah.
You look at the backyard, it looks even to me. So how do you find out where your contours are?
So finding out where your slope goes, usually you can walk it and feel it with your feet. If that doesn't work, wait for it to rain hard and watch where the water moves, because the water will move, right? You know you have slope because your yard doesn't turn into a pond when it rains, or you don't get 2 inches of rain that accumulate 2 inches vertically across the yard. It goes somewhere.
Well, except for the fact that we have about 80% sand soil.
So you have great infiltration, which is great. Yeah. So water will move into the soil quickly. So you can look at where the water's flowing, or you can get an instrument. Right, so a laser transit is the most precise. You can also build a thing called an A-frame, and I can sketch out plans for that after this if you want to know it. The last one I built cost me $27. Lumber and hardware, and for a backyard, it worked great. And it's even a fancy one that like collapses and folds up. So, and it's very easy to use. And so you can find the contour out. Yeah. Okay. So, can I get my time check? What time is it?
Yeah, it's 11:12.
Oh, so I've got 3 minutes. So the small ponds section of the course is they're cool. And we're gonna move forward because I do want to show permacommons because you can literally leave here, go to 14th in Pennsylvania and look at this today. All right, so this is the original design for this garden. So it's a permaculture inspired community garden run through the city of Lawrence, county of Douglas County Common Ground Program. So in this, the slope is from this corner to this corner. So this is the low spot, but it is not very much. Like this is a pretty darn flat lot, which we'll see in the next picture. So they designed 3 swales. So these are ditches on contour. And in this case, they dug them deep, put a French drain tube in them, did it like a French drain, right? So they then put in gravel wrapped in landscape cloth and then topped that off with mulch. So that is a design choice you can make. It's just a little more cost and effort on it. Okay, so they did that. The overflow is where this blue line is, and it's an underground pipe through those pathways. Okay. Then it flows into the lowest corner, and they've got 2 rain gardens that soak and sink water that overflow into a micro pond at the lowest point on the property. And then it overflows into the alleyway. This is also the place that has the big white cisterns that we saw way back at the beginning. So there's one of those in this blue circle. The original design only had one off this roof and one off this roof. There is now also a second one here. So there are a total of 3 of those where they're catching the water running off their neighbors' roofs and using it to water the garden every summer. Okay. So at installation, this is what it looked like. So this is one of those on contour swales. This is one of them, and then this one is one. And so they're in the middle of doing the swale, so you can see the gravel, and they're putting the landscape cloth. There's a perforated French drain tile, plastic pipe in that gravel. And then the mulch top coat gets turned over into the beds every time it breaks down, and you put down new. So we're making soil in the aisles. And then down here, you can see where they were starting to dig out where the ponds are. Okay. So it's pretty cool.
That's open to the public?
You can't walk through the garden unless you're a member, but you can walk along the street and look and see it and walk along the alley. And from those 2, you can see how it's all laid out. It's really pretty.
So do those 2 residences partner with them because you're using the water?
Yes, they got their permission. It's not a co-op. So it's kind of a fun story. So the folks on this side, she also is a fun plant person. And she thought it was so cool that the garden could use her water. And she was like, sure, absolutely. You should put a rain barrel. And she has a lot of fun talking to the gardeners when they're in the garden. And it's just a fun relationship. The other side is actually city-owned low-income housing. And so it's a rental. So people circulate through. So they worked out with the city as the landlord to be able to put those rain barrels, and the condition is that they do all the maintenance on that and the gutters, and that they clean on some frequency the leaves out of these gutters, which is helping them, right, to fill up their rain barrels. So that was the agreement they made. And the city owns this lot, so that made it a pretty easy conversation, right, to have. Yeah.
The filter package, what is the value of that? I know I use this to be more helpful.
I agree. In swales that I do at my house, I don't choose to implement. I just fill them all with mulch, and then I can dig it all out as amazing soil and put new mulch. And that's what I choose to do. In this one, they wanted. Some people really like fancy solutions. And the people who originally installed this garden liked fancy solutions. And so this is what they did. And it works. There's nothing wrong with it, but it isn't what I.
You just use the mulch, you don't put down linters.
Correct. Yeah, I fill the whole thing up with just
Wood chips.
wood chips. And the ones in my garden, I made them a little deeper, and so I actually had like extra logs that I needed to get rid of. I had a tree service drop off a giant load of mulch, and a third of it was actually logs that they had just tossed in the truck.
Perfect.
And so they needed to go somewhere, so I put them in the bottom and then filled it up with mulch. But that's what I do. And I on that property, I also had larger swales, not quite as large as the Olympic swimming pool guy, but much more substantial, that I just left open as ditches because they were, that size. So, yeah.
Is one more work than the other, like the mulch that you have to dig out fairly frequently? Is this more?
You still have to replace the mulch here. Because it turns into soil and soil grows weeds and then your pathway is progress. And so you still have to do that every year or two. So I don't find it to be that way, but other people disagree. And that's okay.
Just getting older.